So, on January 30th, just a few days ago, the Columbia Journalism Review, which is a liberal media watchdog group founded in 1961, published an extensive report on the media failings of Russiagate. The piece is called "The Press versus the President," and it contains exclusive interviews with many involved in the whole Russiagate story, including Donald Trump himself. It's a very lengthy article. It was published in 4 parts, and it reveals the sort of evolution of Russiagate from how it started, which is sort of like this paranoid projection campaign by Team HRC, who, according to internal surveys, she was actually seen as being too friendly to Russia herself.
So these shelves that are so much a beloved part of the set now, those go pretty far up. So I had to get a ladder to pull this out. If anybody remembers this, by Peter Schweitzer. So this was a whole book that exposed Clinton corruption. And one of the stories that it got into was how Clinton's State Department signed off on making a deal with a Russian company that had bought up a Canadian company that had huge uranium resources. This deal was going to give Russia control of 1/5 of North America's uranium. And at the same time, the company was giving huge amounts of money to the Clinton Foundation. This was pretty typical. So now the New York Times, before the Donald Trump actually won, still tried to actually do journalism. So they made a deal with Schweitzer where they could exclusively do follow-up investigations of anything that he claimed in Clinton cash. So that was where that article came from. That was a whole article they did laying out how, suspicious the fact that Clinton's State Department signed off on handing over 1/5 of the nation's uranium to Russia looked, given all the money flowing into the Clinton Foundation. So a lot of Russiagate, based on this article and based on other research that, if you are skeptical of it as we are, you may have done on your own, was basically the Clinton campaign trying to do what Karl Rove always advised. Take your vulnerability and project it onto your opponent.
Exactly.
So the reason the Clinton campaign was so intent on painting Donald Trump as a Russian agent is because they were so vulnerable on this issue themselves.
Right. Yes. So that was the sort of genesis of the Russiagate campaign. And then what this sort of very lengthy 4-part essay here details is how that morphed into this media frenzy. 500,000 articles were printed about Trump and Russia. 500,000.
That's unbelievable.
A huge number. That is a massive number. 500,000 article frenzy and an obsession by the media every single day from the time Trump won until the Mueller report dropped, and even after, ending in an ill-deserved Pulitzer Prize for the New York Times and the Washington Post. And then, of course, once the Mueller report came out, ended in a lot of egg on a lot of faces. But here, this is from Pulitzer.org. This is the official website. Staffs of the New York Times and the Washington Post for deeply sourced, relentlessly reported coverage in the public interest that dramatically furthered the nation's understanding of Russian interference in the 2016 presidential election and its connections to the Trump campaign, the president-elect's transition team, and his eventual administration. The New York Times entry submitted in this category was moved into contention by the board and then jointly awarded the prize, a Pulitzer Prize in 2018.
I've been hearing that
deeply sourced and relentlessly reported. Well, it was relentlessly reported. I don't know about deeply sourced or well sourced, but they got that half right.
Why? I keep hearing that people have lost faith in institutions. What's going on with that? What's up with that? It's very strange. I don't get why they don't trust institutions anymore.
But anyway, among those interviewed in this extensive 4-part piece was Bob Woodward, whose name you may have heard of, right? He was one of the Watergate reporters. And Bob Woodward came out against this Russiagate hysteria fairly early on. In January 2017, he appeared on Fox News with Chris Wallace, who asked him about the Steele dossier. This was in the days between Trump's victory and Trump's inauguration. Here he is. Let's take a look.
When those former CIA people said these things about Trump, that he was a recruited, agent of the Russian...
Useful fool.
Yeah, and a useful fool. I mean, they started this, and in Trump's mind, he knows the old adage, once a CIA man, always a CIA man. And no one came out and said those people shouldn't be saying things. So then Act Two is the briefing when this dossier is put out. I've lived in this world for 45 years where you get things and people make allegations. That is a garbage document. It never should have been presented as part of an intelligence briefing. As you suggested, other channels have the White House counsel give it to Trump's incoming White House counsel. So Trump's right to be upset about that. And I think if you look at the real chronology and the nature of the battle here, those intelligence chiefs who are the best we've had, who are terrific and have done great work, made a mistake here. And when people make mistakes, they should apologize.
Oh, well, you're talking about a bygone era, my friends. Back in your day, the news was a loss leader, so they could apologize if they got a story wrong because the story always came first, right? They weren't incentivized in the way they were this cycle to write 500,000 articles on this to keep the money coming in. Why would they apologize? Why would they apologize just as investigations are ongoing and about to heat up? But anyway, Woodward took some flack for that, right? His peers, at the time, the Washington Post did not appreciate him going on Fox News and calling the Steele dossier a garbage document. And so he apparently went to the Washington Post and had a few talks with a few reporters there. This was revealed in this new piece by Jeff Gerth. He's the one who wrote this 4-part sort of epic Russiagate autopsy. Jeff Gerth, by the way, is a 3-decade veteran of the New York Times himself.
And also remember, this is
not a depraved loser like us writing this, right? It's a pretty credible source, and this is a pretty credible liberal watchdog journal.
He's not scrawling it on the wall of his cell in his own feces.
Exactly.
This is a real document. Also, remember, this is the Columbia Journalism Review. This is not the National Review. All right.
This is a liberal.
This is a very left liberal outlet. This is the same outlet that went after Substack for freedom of speech. Okay. So right. They're not even usually an outlet that we would like because they traffic in that.
Well, that's what makes this a noteworthy piece, is the fact that it's coming from,
of course,
people who you would have thought, an outlet like this would have taken the exact opposite stance on all this.
Of course.
But anyway, Woodward was interviewed for this new piece, and here's what he said. So as the piece reads, after his remarks on Fox, Woodward said he, quote, reached out to people who covered this at the paper, identifying them only generically as reporters to explain why he was so critical. Asked how they reacted, Woodward said, to be honest, there was a lack of curiosity on the part of the people at the Post about what I had said, why I had said this, and I accepted that, and I didn't force it on anyone. In other words, nothing was going to stop them. Nothing was going to stop them from doubling down and tripling down on this, no matter how ridiculous it seemed to the guy who broke the Watergate story. Again, a very credible source on matters like this.
And let me just say, back then, the two things that made me from the beginning decide that this was definitely BS, that I was never going to be proven wrong by taking a stand against Russiagate, which I did pretty early on, was the combination of Bob Woodward, I remember this, of him coming out against it. Because look, Bob Woodward, he is definitely a lib, but he is a journalist in the old school tradition, in the tradition that Matt Taibbi describes, where to him, the idea of getting a fact wrong would be humiliating. The idea that he really needs to be correct more than he needs to be partisan. I actually read his book on the early days of the Trump administration that were written while the administration was in office, fear. And yeah, it was very dry and it was refreshingly honest. I thought one of the most interesting scenes in it that I think a more partisan reporter wouldn't have included was that Trump, according to people around him, seemed very disturbed by calling parents of fallen soldiers. That really, the way he described it, it really didn't fit the Trump narrative. It sounded like he was upset by doing that. And, my read on it when I read that was, it's one thing to fuck a guy in a real estate deal. It's another thing to be in charge of the military industrial complex and to have to call parents about their dead kid. Like, whatever you think of Trump, the kinds of evils that Trump was used to are nothing compared to the evils of running the United States. He wasn't prepared for that kind of evil. That's how I read that scene. But reading that, I had a lot of respect for the fact that he included it, because a more partisan reporter wouldn't have put that in. It was too humanizing.
Yeah, no, I mean, that is definitely a good point. And, I thought that this whole piece just very, methodically, like I said, it's quite long, traced the evolution of this story from a sort of campaign story that the team failed to get off the ground. I mean, Clinton's campaign was really trying to make this an issue during 2016, which really just shows you how dumb they were, how awful they were, that in a year of such obvious tumult between Brexit and the rise of Trump itself and the rise of Sanders itself, the fact that there's all this tumult happening around you and you remain stubbornly committed to exposing Trump as what? Duly loyal to the U.S. and Russia, as if it's 1974? Like, what world are you living in? What world are you living in where you actually thought that was a winning issue to begin with? The amount of capital spent on trying to get this story going during that campaign was just insane. It was just the dumbest thing you could ever. I mean, this is how that campaign lost. This campaign did not have its finger on the pulse of anything that was going on anywhere near them. Anywhere near them. They didn't go to Michigan. They didn't go to Wisconsin. They're meeting with donors all the time. They're not getting out. They're not rallying the public. And they're trying to, at the same time, paint Donald Trump as what? As Paul Krugman called him, as the piece cites, a Siberian candidate. As if this is a spy novel, as if people did not have real problems that were reaching a boiling point, and this wasn't manifesting itself in all these sorts of shock populist uprisings all around the world. Just completely missed on them.
Well, this is very typical of the problem with the Democratic Party on the whole. Clinton's campaign was a microcosm of what's wrong with the post-Clinton Democrats. They don't have an economic message. And in the absence of that, they're forced to rely on trying to gin up outrage about cultural issues, which interestingly is what they accuse the Republicans of, which is not to say the Republicans are not guilty of that. Of course they are. But so are the Democrats. I mean, it's just pick your poison. Pick which drummed up cultural outrage machine you want to pledge your loyalty to. Also, Thomas Frank says this very well. There's a video by Thomas Frank. He did an interview with a French magazine, and it's called I think it's called Clinton Lost Because Democrats Abandoned the Working Class. It's called something like that. You can find it on YouTube. And he says, for Democrats to admit that their old working class base is now in the Republican Party is very painful for them. It's something they don't want to look at. They don't want to talk about. And for someone like Hillary to admit that is to admit that the triumph of their class, the triumph of their generation was all a mistake.
Right.
Like, she could not turn back to being the blue collar Democrat. They were the ones who destroyed their relationship with blue collar people. They'd have to go back to pre-Clinton Democratic Party, and she was the last person who was going to do that. That would be to repudiate the entire legacy of her dynasty.
Yeah, and not to mention upend the entire system that they have basically been architecting for the past 40 years, right? Like it just would have been too disruptive for them to imagine doing that. That's what Sanders represented, and that's why there was such hostility to his movement. And in terms of the, Trump Russia narrative, just the idea that that was going to be a sticking point with voters at that time was just a way of obscuring their own failures, and it continued to obscure their own failures well into the Trump years, to the point where even after the Mueller report dropped out, even today, you had David Corn at Mother Jones, who's mentioned in this article, attempt a sort of rebuttal of this and blame the fact that the Podesta emails dropped on the same day that the Donald Trump Access Hollywood tape came out, as if the American people didn't care about the Access Hollywood tape because they were distracted by the Podesta email dump and that was a Russian op. No. Once again, just a total unwillingness to acknowledge what is right in front of your face, which is the reason why Trump's grab them by the pussy line was not as disqualifying as perhaps it should have been, is because Hillary Clinton's husband has been credibly accused of rape, and she led the charge on his campaign to shut the women who accused him of rape the fuck up so they didn't derail his path to power, which she knew was her path to power. That's a fucked up, disgustingly amoral person who would do that. Okay? And so therefore, Hillary Clinton is no one's moral superior, not even Donald Trump's. So it's not that they liked what they heard on the Access Hollywood tape. It's that next to her record of smearing accusers of her husband from everything from harassment to, yes, full-on forcible rape, people said, well, it's a wash. It's a wash. And that's a dark situation that the country is in when they have to make that kind of a Sophie's choice. But that's the situation that you put them in. And you need to own the fact that you put people in a spot where that Access Hollywood tape was not disqualifying. And there is no acknowledgement of that whatsoever. These people just act as if that doesn't matter to people. They act as if people are not capable of doing their own research and learning things about candidates that they don't tell them. This is another phenomenon of the Russiagate era, this idea of trustworthy and untrustworthy sources. They hate the fact that people know things that they don't tell them, right?
Yes.
You know what I mean?
Yes. It was really during the Trump era that something that had been bubbling really boiled over. The fact that elites felt like they were losing their power to control the conversation. And they used, this is why Russiagate won't die, because you have too many parties who benefit too much from that narrative. It allows you to justify censorship, which is something that they deeply want. And in the immediate aftermath of 2016, you had two very powerful entities in society, the Democratic Party and the media, both had a vested interest in deflecting attention from themselves for getting Donald Trump elected. You had a media that did not want to reckon with the fact that they gave this man $1 billion in free advertising.
Right.
They did not want people talking about them covering his empty podium.
Right.
And certainly the Democratic Party did not want focus on the campaign that Hillary ran, or the fact that they anointed her as the nominee 2 years before anyone voted, in spite of the fact that they knew her flaws. They knew that she was deeply unpopular throughout the country, that she would, in fact, be the most unpopular nominee that they had ever chosen. They didn't want any attention on that. So that's why it didn't matter what Bob Woodward said to them. There was no upside to them in listening to Bob Woodward.
Right, exactly. They needed something. They also needed their own
They
excuse,
needed it. Right. They needed Russiagate.
Please clap.